Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm so glad you could join us. My name is Lina. I'm a manager of consumer insights at Sila, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Before we dive in, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for taking the time to attend. I know we all have busy schedules, and it means a lot that you've chosen to spend some of your valuable time with us. So today's webinar is all about understanding how AI is changing the way we track and measure brand performance. I'm joined today by our head of research, Faisal Khan, who will be sharing more on digital brand health tracking. Faisal has spent over 2 decades in consumer insights, worked with leading research organizations throughout his experience, almost all of which has been in the Middle East. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. We'll be covering a lot of ground, but don't worry, we'll be sure to have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. So please don't hesitate to ask anything that comes to mind over the chat box, and we'll ensure to answer all of them towards the end of the session. Also, please know that this webinar is being recorded and can be shared with you afterwards. So without further ado, let's get started. Over to you, Faisal.
Thank you very much, Lina. Thanks for that introduction. Thank you, everyone who's joining online. So the topic for today is brand tracking in the age of AI. Brand tracking is an exciting topic. It's perhaps one of the oldest forms of research, one of the simplest forms of research, but also the most strategic pieces of research, which pretty much every organization understands and does, because it's almost like, you have to know your health status of your brand, how well you're doing, what's not working, what's working. However, things have changed and AI has come into picture. The digital landscape has changed. It's changed the dynamics of how brands behave. And in that context, today we're going to be talking about how you can really measure and track your digital presence, influence, and impact. So how the next 60 minutes are expected to look like. I'll kind of do a quick revisit and remind you of your university days where you were studying Philip Kotler. A very few minutes just to kind of revisit some basics of brand health. I won't take too much long, I promise, on that section, but the core part of the presentation is expected to be on the actual digital brand health tracker in terms of why it's important, and more importantly, how you can actually do it, how you can measure your brand health and equity and kind of track it over a period of time. We've also got some case studies in precise. There are 3 case studies we're going to be talking about from 3 different sectors, right from home appliances, foods, to an airlines brand. And we'll end with some question and answers that you've probably got for us. So we see a lot of brands around us. You've got MNCs like, Nikes of the world, Apple. You've got great local giants like Almarai, Emirates Airlines. And none of these brands just happened, right? There's a lot of effort that goes behind building these brands. They're built, they're tracked, they're refined. And I was having a discussion with one of the brand custodians a few days back. And one very important point and pertinent point is that brands not only about building that relevance and initial effort that goes behind it, but it's also more challenging. And what makes it more challenging is staying relevant, because especially in an environment where your consumers are changing very fast. Otherwise, you also have examples like the Nokias of the world, the Blackberries of the world, the Polaroids of the world that have struggled because they haven't been able to track and understand the consumer and been able to refine in a timely manner. With that context, let's visit some basics. What is brand health? So brand health per se, there's no real definition or single definition of brand health or what brand health really means. But just to give a simple analogy to understand brand health, it's just like the health of you and me, right? People like us who go to a doctor and what they call in the medical terms vital signs, right? Which is typically your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, your body temperature. They're like basic vital signs that they check to measure and assess your health. And you do that at a frequent basis, depending on your medical history, depending on your background, depending on your age, for instance. You kind of go at a certain frequency to keep a check on your health. And that's similar when it comes to brand health. Brand health, similar to what we've got in the medical terms to test our health status, which is the vital signs. You've got some metrics that are used to test your brand health. There are various aspects in which you can check how well your brand is doing and what is the health status of your brand or what's the equity of your brand. What you see here as a visual is the most common, what we call as the brand funnel, which starts from how many people are aware of your brand, consider your brand, that moves up to using your brand, and eventually kind of being advocates of your brand. These are loyal customers, loyal consumers who would go and tell people to have your brand and even pay a premium for your brand. So these are the similar vital signs, so to say, of checking your brand. And there are a variety of other aspects that you can check to understand your brand health. Now, what is brand health tracker? Brand health tracker is nothing but it is the metrics that you're checking for your brand at a regular frequency. That could be on a monthly basis, that could be on a biannual basis, that could also be year on year, where you're checking these metrics at how you're performing. And why it's important to test that and why it's important to track that is because all the awareness that you see, all the consideration that you see, all the advocacy that you see around your brand are basically a result of what we call as brand building efforts. So all the TV communication you're doing, all the PR you're doing, all the in-store activations you're doing, there's a significant amount of effort that you're constantly doing, that you're constantly kind of working behind the scenes to be able to make more people aware of your brand, to make people consider your brand, to make more people loyal towards your brand, use your brand, and so on and so forth, right? And have the positive associations with your brand. And that becomes, and to be able to kind of, what a brand health tracker would do would be able to assess your brand building efforts and see how do you kind of refine them as you progress, optimize your spends, optimize your efforts, and see whether they're on track or not, and whether they're resulting at eventually growth. With doing all that, it's very strategic in nature. Like I said upfront, it's because you're able to make informed decisions, whether that's, and it's all about growth at the end of the day. It's about increasing sales. It's about greater return on your marketing and innovation investments. It's about winning market share. And once you know exactly how well your brand efforts are being, the kind of impact and influence they have, you're able to kind of take informed decisions that help you eventually grow. And how do organizations currently track this health of their brand? How do they measure it? What are the KPIs? How they go about tracking them? So pretty much every leading organization or every brand, most organizations, depending on some small budgets, some big budgets, but pretty much most of the organizations do have a brand health tracker in place, and rightfully so. We've already established how important knowing your health status is, and how important and what kind of decisions you can kind of take based on that. But how it's currently done is using, typically it's a survey-based quantitative methodology where you have a list of questions where you go to people and ask people about it. So for instance, you might go to people and say, here's a list of chocolate brands. Which are the brands have you heard of? And you check awareness. Which of the brands have you tried? Which of the brands would you recommend to other people? So you have those list of questions which you can get responded collectively at a base of 1,000, 1,500, 500, depending on the budgets, and you get your output. And that's how it's been currently done, which is great, which is how it should be, and which should be continue to be done. But things have changed over time, right? And what has changed? We've spoken about this, right? So everything we're doing eventually is, or the brand health tracking that we're doing eventually, is really about assessing the efforts that are going behind building your brand, right? And those efforts are changing, and hence things need to be looked in a different perspective. I'll just explain that a little more. And it's primarily digital media, right? So digital media has changed everything we knew about the ways brands should behave. This is a slide which I don't think I need to emphasize much, because everyone on this call who's attending is very familiar with how the digital landscape is changing things. So whether those are marketing budgets are transitioning to digital, how businesses are increasing their digital media spends, how advertising is becoming everything going online and becoming digital. And in that context, what happens typically is that your digital plays a huge role in what your brand stands for. So it has a direct, what you're doing digitally on digital platforms has an impact on all metrics that we talked about the brand, right? Whether that's awareness, perceptions, advocacy, and it's not necessarily only when you're online, but it has impact even when you're going to a store. You'll have a recall of the social communication of the social influencer that you saw, and that has an impact on the overall saliency and priorities that you're giving to the brand. So in today's environment, your mass communication and mass advertising budgets are moving to digital campaigns. Your new brand ambassadors are your social media influencers. your new trade channel, your new trade channels, or your e-commerce, your word of mouth, or your online reviews and ratings. So you go on a Amazon, give reviews, you go on a Google, you give reviews, you go on a Make My Trip, give reviews. And the new search, of course, is Google search. So you're going for everything, your starting point often is Google search. So it's a new world you're living in, and not necessarily new anymore, actually. If you think about it, it's been 10, 20 years since the digital landscape has been changing. Today, it's just become much more prominent, much more influential, much more impactful in terms of the status and the impact it has on your brand. What does this hence warrant? This warrants checking and testing and tracking your brand in the online, in the digital world. So yes, I would still like to say, I would still like to believe that brand health tracking per se is significant. You still can do you should still go out, ask people about awareness, measuring the metrics, but over and above that, it becomes important what people think, are saying, are feeling about your brand in the online world, and almost kind of calculate an index like you would do in your regular trackers, and measure that and track that over a period of time. Only doing quantitative based surveys asking about awareness of the various metrics to check your brand health only gives partial information. It is not giving you a full view, because a lot is happening and being said in your digital space. And hence we're going to be focusing on what and how do you actually track your brand health status on the digital world. What this enables you to do. So we talked about, and this is a misconception, and why this was important to put up front is because people, or my discussions that we've been having, are often like, okay, so my digital brand, what is my saliency of my brand digitally? What is my impact or the influence my brand has on people's decision making is often restricted, or there's a myth that it only has an implication in, let's say, online shopping or the way people are behaving digitally. But that's not the case. Yes, it does have a digital brand health tracker, of course, and necessarily so will help you in every decision and every brand building effort you're taking in the digital space, whether that's your social media, influencer campaigns, your channelizing of your digital spends, where to spend, how to spend, your share of voice, etc. So you kind of, all that is there. But also your mass marketing initiatives. So because there is a strong correlation between what your brand stands for, what is being spoken about, even in everything that you're doing when you're not online. So that was more theory. That was more in terms of why brand health tracking per se is important, why tracking your digital presence is important, and that's pretty much we've kind of established. And this is something which we are pretty much convinced, because we ourselves are consumers at the end of the day, spending a lot of time online. And I mean, when I go out and when I book a hotel, I would always go and check reviews on multiple third-party platforms to check what to do with how the hotel reviews are, and true for other FMCG products, services that we kind of take. Now that we've established the significance and the relevance of it, the big question is, how do you measure and track your digital brand health? And everything here becomes, and this is the introduction of AI, and where AI kind of comes into picture. This is perhaps in my mind the most important slide of the presentation and today's discussion, because it gives you a framework, it gives you a complete picture in terms of the how part of digital brand health tracking. So it kind of gives you a very clear picture in one slide in terms of what should your approach be and what can help you understand the status of your brand. It's in a way, there are two pillars that we will be talking about. The first pillar is everything that's organic in nature, right from what a brand is doing. So how the brand is engaging with the people. So it's all about, let's say, your socials, how you're communicating, your posts, everything that you're talking about organically in the digital space. Two, it's also about what are the people talking about organically, again, in terms of your brand and context of your brand. So any kind of direct conversations, any kind of comments, any reviews on any of the social media platforms or third-party review platforms, but whatever is generated from the consumer himself, herself, in the online space. So a combination of this is kind of gives you a good perspective of your digital brand health, where you're measuring everything in terms of the impact your brand has in the online space. So how many people are engaging with your content, how many people are, what are they talking about? So right from your efforts, a brand's efforts, to consumer generated conversations, and collectively they kind of give you a good view of what your brand health status is. Having said that, that is still one part of what we call as the overall brand health perspective. The second part is all your paid efforts, what we call as paid media, which are your social media campaigns, your digital campaigns that you're running, and how much you're spending on it across the different channels, how you're running your campaigns, how successful those campaigns are, what is the impact of those campaigns. And we also include influencers here, which are basically another strong pillar of communication that brands rely on today, where, like I was saying a while back, that your new brand ambassador are your macro influencers out there, which you're engaging with, which you're generating content with. How much impact are they as individuals, as brand ambassadors for your brand having, and the content they're producing with respect to your brand. Now, this together, which is what we call as everything that's organic, everything that's paid, this is pretty much summarizes whatever is happening in this digital space. So right from what content you're producing, whether that's earned or paid, whether that's your influencer campaign, and in that, everything, your consumer generated content that's being kind of consumers are organically talking about in context of either generally or in context of your campaigns that are happening. And that together, this framework gives you an entire perspective of what your brand health status is. What becomes also important is not only understanding your brand as a standalone, because that is again gives you a single perspective of only your brand. All this needs to be captured in context of your competition set. So then you actually can start seeing shares, because similarly to what we see in a typical health tracking output, where you would have aspects around, how many people are aware of your brand versus how many people are aware of, your competition set. Similarly, advocacy or any other metric. So similarly here, everything that gets captured for your own brand, gets captured for your competition set, and then you have an overall picture of what your brand stands for in the competitive set from a consumer perspective. I'll briefly talk about some aspects of this. I've spoken about the most kind of the details already on it, so I won't spend too much time of each one of these slides, but broadly to tell you what kind of information areas you should look at when you're capturing this kind of information out here. So when you're talking about saliency or your presence, online presence itself, so it's about saliency. It's how present are you? It's the equivalent of, let's say, an awareness, right? Where you're saying how salient is your brand, and how much impact does it have in the online space in terms of voice, and of course perceptions, which are what are people talking about, positive, negative emotions that people are reflecting about. And the third thing is, who is this person? So it's the presence, it's the perception, it's the profile. And again, you do this, for example, when you're looking at presence, you're talking about the impact you're making in the digital space, but also versus competition. So share of voice, share of reach, share of search. And it's simple things, but when you have, like, for example, the slide you see on the right-hand side, an example here is simple. There are 4 plant-based milk brand options that you see out there. And this is how the proportion of people that go on Google and search for this brand in this case, in Saudi and in UAE. So it's simple. It gives you a contextual information with respect to your own brand, your competition brand, and you understand how many people are looking up for your brand on Google. This is just one thing. Similarly, you could do for your volume of conversations, how many consumers are you talking about your brand versus competition, which becomes your share of voice. Your share of reach becomes how much is your content reaching versus how much competition is reaching out to consumers. And that becomes your overall digital saliency and presence and the impact you're able to create and the influence you have. Followed by perception. Perception is similar. What you talk about, associations, reputation, the experiences, the sentiments, the emotions people associate with your brand. And then profile. Who's your digital audience? Who are these people? Right from the demographic profile to the psychographic profiling of your brand. And who are these people who are talking about it, and how aligned are they with your TG? And you also kind of get to track that. One important thing, and anyone who's done brand health tracking is very familiar with, is equity indexes. So every organization, let's say if you're doing a survey-based methodology, whether that's winning brands with Nielsen, a brand health tracker with Kantar, or something with Ipsos, or any of the other organizations out there, they will have a score, they have a maths, they have a science behind it, which they track over a period of time to understand and assess. So while you have multiple data points, but it's always easier to look at that one equity index, like they say, or health index, like they say, and track that over a period of time. And similarly, stretching that logic, whatever we saw on the previous slide in terms of a combination of information areas that get captured in terms of measuring your brand health status, all those metrics are put together, come together in a scientific manner to form an index. And there are various organizations can do it, differently in different ways. We have our own way, for example. And the only thing to keep in mind when you're actually doing that, or when you're having any discussion around understanding or creating a digital equity index, is to separate out all the brand efforts and also community. You should always also look at community. When I say community, it's consumers as a standalone, to see what they're actually talking about. So there could be a combination of a few indices that can be used to measure this. The third is what we talked about, the second pillar in our framework, which is our paid media measurement, which is essentially, it's complicated, but to simplify it, it's tracking and keeping a track of all your spends, ad, influencer work that's happening, and measuring the effectiveness of it. And measuring the effectiveness of it, because you can actually correlate the previous slides and the previous information areas with the digital campaign. So you have a campaign, your associations might go more positive, or your volume or share of voice might increase because of a certain campaign that you've run, or certain influencer you've started working with. So you start kind of tracking that, and you look at it again from a more realistic spends perspective, because it really helps you then optimize your spends and how you're actually kind of managing it between the different platforms, so to say, on your social media strategies, etc., and what is creating more impact. And when we see real-time case studies, we'll have a richer perspective on this. This kind of gives you the framework and an understanding of how you're doing it. But there's three magical pillars that we kind of talk about when we're talking about brand equity trackers. And this kind of really where the game changes, and where AI's real power is kind of comes into picture, comes into action. The first is contextualizing from a historic perspective. And that means with the AI capabilities, what happens is you have access to data, to information right from history. So let's say 2018, 2019, 2020. So if you think you're late, let's say in starting a digital brand health tracker, yes, you are late, but you aren't late. And precisely because even if you're starting a brand tracker, digital brand health tracker today, you kind of revisit data from 2018 onwards. You set KPIs and see how your brand health has evolved from, let's say, 2018 onwards till date in real time. And from here on, you can actually, based on this, there's a lot of strategic changes that can be done based on 3-year data, 4-year data. And then from here on, you continually track at a certain frequency and see how it's evolving from time. It helps you set KPIs, it helps you kind of track performance, but it's just magical when you start seeing data, and you might have realized the significance and importance of starting to track your digital health today. But once you have data accessible from 2018 onwards, you have a full context, a full view, and you can actually see and correlate with all the efforts you've been doing, whether it's online or offline. The second magical pillar in my mind is norms. So you have, what we've spoken about is measuring your brand health as a standalone, and also in the context of your competition, which is great. But let's say I have a brand health equity of, I don't know, hypothetically 67 basis points or 67%. Whether that's good or bad, 67% might be very poor for a CPG brand, a food brand, or might be amazing for a telecom brand or any kind of service points where people are usually negative about. So that's where norms come into picture, where you start measuring your performance to that of a category, a sector. So whether that's telecom, whether that's hospitality, whether that's FMCG, foods, however you define your sector, you have that, and you look at the average and see how you're performing, and this gives you contextualization of whether your performance, whether that number in itself is good. Of course, you have a competitive perspective, but you have a larger perspective of the category norm itself, the sectoral norm itself. Similarly, geography, where you look at Saudi, you look at GCC, or even you look at global, where you kind of set a norm and saying that I want to see whether in Saudi, what is an average based on, let's say, 1,000 brands, 2,000 brands, 5,000 brands. What is based on historic data? What is an average norm of a good brand health, or what is the average, a brand equity? And you kind of then measure your performance against it. And you can do that by, I don't know, norms by age, again, with AI, it doesn't limit you to look at any specific thing. Depending on your strategic objectives, you can have norms around demographic, you can have norms around geography, you can have sectoral norms, or whatever norms you would like. The third big pillar, and this is to me, I think the second most important slide after the framework itself, is where true magic comes when you look at correlations, when you look at statistical deviations. And there are three various pillars within this where you can look at what kind of correlations I'm talking about. The first is correlations between all the data you've captured in the digital brand health tracker itself, right? Nothing from outside, but within that data set of everything you've captured. We saw influencer, we saw, let's say, share of search, we saw brand generated content, we saw consumer generated content, we saw paid media, all that. And when you have all that data with you, independent data points, you kind of start drawing patterns and identifying any kind of trends or correlatory analysis that helps you understand what is dependent on what. For instance, you might have a digital campaign of a certain kind, which has a direct implication on the number of people that are, let's say, going to Google and looking for your brand. Or you might have not a campaign, but you might have started an engagement with a new influencer, and you started seeing there's a huge impact on the sentiment towards your brand, which is moving from more negative or positive, or the other way around, where you've engaged with, had a series of influencers or campaigns, and that kind of, for some reason, that there's an incident that happens and that kind of impacts, or event that happens that kind of impacts the sentiment on your brand. So all the data within that data set of digital that you've captured during the study or while tracking the brand health status, digital brand health status, looking at correlatory measures, and then you can understand what really impacts what, and what's, how you can kind of channelize your brand building efforts in the digital space. The second is offline performance indicators. Like I said, these two worlds coexist. So you have a social media strategy, a social media digital campaign, but you also have a TV campaign. You have a brand ambassador, but you also have a social media influencer, right? You have an in-store activation, you also have an e-commerce strategy in place. So how is the offline performance indicators correlating with the online indicators? For example, you might see that, and once you have that data, like for example, we kind of often have access to that data as well. When you have access to a duration or the impact or the measurement of, of your TV advertising, and you correlate that with, let's say, again, your share of search or any kind of, volume of people that have started talking about your brand, or any other digital metric that we're talking about, or digital brand saliency. So you can again draw kind of a connection, a correlation between the people who, from your actual mass communication that you've done, a TV advertisement have you done, on your digital saliency, and that might be correlated. Again, over time, you can also start seeing if there are certain kinds of ads that have more impact than other kinds of ads on your digital presence. So it's really about bringing both the worlds together and finding correlations. And again, then you can kind of really optimize your overall strategy, marketing strategy from that perspective. The third is internal performance indicators, which could be your sales, market share. So let's say if you have data from, if you're an FMCG brand who's got data from Nielsen retail measurement services, where they're giving you a market share, and you take that tracking of the market share, overlay it with, let's say, share of search or share of reach or volume of conversations or sentiment or whatever digital metric, we can kind of, that's all customizable. But you start seeing patterns again, that there is a certain, again, whether it's a kind of a campaign or spends are directly proportional. How much you're spending on a digital campaign has a direct impact on, let's say, sales or market share. And sometimes what happens, you might not see that immediately, but again, when you have access to data from 2018 onwards, and then kind of continually tracking it, 1 year from now, if not immediately, you can start seeing patterns of the correlation. And once you have these three, when you're looking at correlations between these three aspects within your digital data, between your offline and online world, and also internal performance indicators, by the end of once you're tracking data, 1 year, 2 years, you'll start seeing, you start seeing a story, you'll start seeing patterns where you really know what is working for your brand, what is not working for your brand, what kind of, communication works, what kind of activation works, what kind of influencers work. And you just kind of your brand building efforts kind of keep getting better and better, and you can track it through your equity index as you progress over time. So that's broadly in terms of detailing out the how of a digital brand health tracker and how AI actually comes into picture to be able to draw correlations, to collect the data, to do all the analysis. And this is millions of data points that come together, talk to each other, and give you a story and a very clear perspective. What we do is look at some case studies. There are some case studies we've taken, and we're happy to kind of connect with some of you, whoever is interested, to kind of look at more specific case studies who have specific business challenges of specific sectors. But what I'm going to do is take you through three case studies in short, and talk about the impact it created for a brand. And all three are unique sectors. So one's an aviation, second's a food ingredient brand, third's a niche home appliance brand. And there are three different types. So the first one is generally seeing the impact of an event. The second one is really about a paid digital media campaign and how it correlates to a lot of other brand health measures. And the third is the impact of an influencer campaign and influencer engagement, and how that again affects brand saliency in the digital world. The first one is something very familiar to all of us. We've all been following the World Cup. There was a lot of news, a lot of anticipation, a lot of fear, a lot of a lot of emotions that were going on in terms of understanding how this event is going to take place and how that's going to impact some of the leading sponsors of the brand. Qatar Airways, of course, being one of the primary sponsors. We kind of tried to look into how the event impacted the brand health of Qatar Airways per se. And I'm going to share a few output slides that we had in terms of what a single event kind of does when you look at it from a historic perspective and start tracking it, and what a single event of that size has impact on brand health and how you can kind of build on it. So what we did is looked at certain brand saliency overall of Qatar Airways in context of some key competition brands, and saw how the event will change things. So here are some examples, a few of them. This is a share of search, and Emirates Airlines, like we all know, is one of the leading global airlines, and it is for the first time history. This is data from 2021 onwards till real time, where you're accessing the proportion of people going on Google and searching for that brand, and it's a separate topic in itself, but share of search is a topic in itself. It's a very powerful data point, because it's almost, brands have started using it as a surrogate to real-time market share, because it's a direct indication of how much people are interested in your brand, and eventually it does lead to market share. But that aside, for the first time, an event has helped Qatar Airways reach that of levels of Emirates, which is a big win, which is a big impact it has been able to create. The second is we looked at sentiment. So what you see on the chart above is 86 basis points, which is basically it's a calculation that goes behind to understand a balance between positive and negative. 86 is a healthy number on its own. But if you look at it, and this is data and an average basis point from 2020 onwards, and we have everyday data, we have monthly data that we kind of analyze and look into, but it gives you an overall sentiment in a 4-year period of what is my sentiment that people associate with all positive and negative comments, associations with my brand. And when we culled out data on, or when we were tracking the data, basically, we looked at only the duration of the World Cup. And during the World Cup, it was 94, which is a huge jump, 8 basis point up, an upward increase in sentiment at 8 basis points, just driven by a World Cup, because as primary sponsors, as a successful event, how that impacts brand. And this was a real win for the brand in itself, because you see real-time impact in terms of what people perceive you as a brand. Similarly, we did emotions, and we saw, it was interesting, because when you look at the overall emotions. And as we progress towards the World Cup, just before the World Cup, one of the biggest chunk of emotion was anticipation. There was a lot of fear also, which was significant. So there was fear, there was some related to trust, anticipation. Because there was a lot of mixed emotions. What's going to happen? Is it going to be successful? Can they pull it off? Not pull it off? And that again has direct implication on a brand. And in this case, when you see just the duration, your happiness quotient goes up from 35% to 50%. So 15% people are happier with respect to Qatar Airways versus the overall emotions they've had always or associated with the brand. And all that 15% is taken from anticipation. So that anticipation got converted into happiness. And as an eventual impact, when we were tracking the brand equity and we compared it with the category names are there, basically the top leading GCC national airlines out there. But for the first time, again, your brand index or brand equity index that we calculated or the net sentiment that we calculated was higher than the overall category. And when we track this data, you'll actually see that this is the only point in time where they were more than the overall category. Otherwise, Emirates kind of your Qatar Airways performance is usually below the category. It's for the first time it went above the category. So that's one example of an impact of an event and how you track data and how you can start correlating specific events to the performance. And again, it's a brand building effort. The event was a brand building effort. So it could be similar for other efforts that you're doing and kind of correlate and see the direct impact on what people are saying, how much they're saying, what they're saying about your brand. This is another example of a paid media measurement for a food ingredients brand. We've masked the brands here, but just to kind of give you some kind of, again, correlatory examples of when you're doing paid media and how it kind of impacts certain things. The brands of interest are your brand D, which is the biggest kind of highest spends, and brand E, which is a brand which was of our interest. And we kind of analyzed certain data points to look into this. Won't spend too much time on this, but we looked at correlations between digital campaigns and overall associations with the brand, and there was a very strong impact. So the biggest brand or the biggest spends may not necessarily have the highest impact, but it is really about finding that balance or that perfect spend or that perfect share of voice, and in terms of course the qualitative aspect of the efficacy of that communication to be able to leading to that. But we did see a direct proportion of the campaign period of the net sentiment improving to the campaign period. So you could actually see how much each of the campaigns were resulting in the positive associations with the brand. Similarly, this is an interesting analysis where you can actually see your the blue line, which is your campaign period. It's actually the video views of a campaign, and the orange line is where you're seeing your share of search. Share of search is, again, simply people going online and kind of looking for your brand. And you could find a perfect threshold level of saying that when views reach a certain level, and how much it leads people to go and search, how much interest it creates for them to be able to go online and search for your brand. And that threshold, it's not really necessarily about a high view. It's really finding the threshold which is that perfect threshold in terms of view, and that becomes your KPI going forward in terms of this view has highest impact that results in creating an interest in my brand. So again, you can draw those correlations and start seeing and kind of seeing direct impact on the overall status of your brand and what your brand equity is. I'll skip this one. The last one, and we're just going to take 2-3 minutes before we move on to our questions. But here's a case study on digital saliency. So here's a niche home appliance brand that was new to the region and very expensive, premium, and had a very low awareness. And if you don't have awareness, you don't move on to the next stages of the funnel. So your first objective becomes improving awareness. And that's where they kind of engaged with, we did where you kind of do a study to understand the baseline, the foundational understanding of where they stand, what is the awareness, engage with it. They engage with some influencer campaigns and start seeing how much that is impacting your brand saliency, and which is the first and the most basic aspect of any brand health status check. And you could see this is the brand's saliency. So what you see up is the campaign. This was specific campaigns by a specific influencer, where you see of course the campaign information, but then you see how that impacts your brand salience as a standalone. Specific, what you see in the area that's highlighted is during that period and how much it's impacting the awareness of people of that brand in digital world. And we, again, did a breakdown by month to look at share of voice. The different colors you see are different brands, again, masked for confidentiality reasons. But this was a 3-month period where the campaign was run right from November to December and January. And our clients' share of voice, in terms of the competitive context, was they started off with 5.57%, second one moved on to 7.6, and then again reached to the 8s. And it's still work in progress. But again, you start measuring the basic components. Once you've reached a level of a certain saliency, then your next task becomes and next strategic point of strategic need becomes building, let's say, coming into the consideration set of people, and then of course eventually leading to advocacy. But you have to get to your basic level of awareness before that, and this is a direct impact of how you're able to measure brand awareness, brand saliency in the retail world. So that's the 3 case studies that we did. I do hope that it kind of gives you a good picture in terms of establishing the relevance of how important it is to measure and track your digital brand health, and how you can do it, how you can go about it, and what are the aspects to keep in mind, and what kind of AI technologies when I say AI technologies, what kind of advantages AI can kind of leverage you with to be able to draw a lot of powerful correlations. And we saw some case studies, but I'll leave you guys for any question and answers. Lena, can you check if you've got any private messages or any specific questions that I can take?
Certainly. Thank you so much. First off, thanks a lot, Faisal, for the great insights. I'm sure this has been very informative, very interesting for everyone watching this. So let's get started with the Q&As. If you haven't already done so, please feel free to send your questions to me via the chat box. And this can be about anything. If you're looking for a clarification, or if you have a more specific question about how AI can be applied to brand tracking, just let us know. So the first question that we have is this. So Faisal, to you, if a brand has multiple categories, how is that then taken into consideration in tracking brand health?
That's an interesting one. So you have a lot of conglomerate brands which would operate into multiple categories, right? So I mean, whether that's the Nestle's of the world, that's Almarai's of the world, Al Rababi's, or even Emirates and stuff like that. So there are multiple brands. So you do, when you have a requirement like this, the best way to approach is look at 2 data sets separately. One data set should be focused at a brand level. So you're looking at data set at just, let's say, if it's Nestle, just at a Nestle level, looking at what that equity is, you track that. But what happens is, Nestle is not the best example, because Nestle might have different brand names, but I'm thinking of something that might have multiple. So for example, Almarai would have Almarai brand into cheese also and into juices also. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, here you've got two different categories, very different from each other with different audiences. So you measure an Almarai or a mother brand tracking, which should be an independent piece, but it becomes necessary to look at it at category level, because your competition set will also change. So what you do, and your brand health might be very different for category 1 vice versa. For category 1, if I'm operating into, let's say, cheese, or my awareness might be top, my advocacy will be healthy, I might have the highest share of voice, etc. But let's say in juices, again, I'm not giving any specific examples, it's all hypothetical, but in juices, my awareness may not be as high. It could be because of various reasons. But then what you do, you start identifying and breaking it down by categories and looking at that brand from that. Your universe becomes that category. Your competition set becomes your key competition within that category, and you observe and track the brand health within that category for that brand, and you do it separately for, let's say, category 2 or category 3. Eventually, you should have one number also that's giving you an overall picture, but it's important because your strategies, you'll have different category heads, different people looking after different verticals, different categories. So again, it becomes important to look at for that brand and track that brand health in the context of that category.
All right. Sounds great. So, also taking that into consideration, is it possible to see if the brand health is weaker or stronger with a certain profile of people, like, say, amongst a specific nationality or age?
Yes, AI will allow you to do that. So you'll be able to, of course, you have a big picture, and every organization, every brand want to look at a big picture. But again, when you're tracking data, you would want to track, as a brand might be interested in, I might have a strategic objective for the year to, let's say, I might be a bank who has a target of, let's say, getting Emiratis on board. or I might be a telecom provider who might wanting to get, let's say, young millennials on board, so I might have a very strategic objective where I'm targeting a specific nationality, a specific age profile, a specific gender, or even a specific market. So you'll be able to kind of look at typically the how the outputs are. Of course you get reports and everything, but you have real-time dashboards that allow you to kind of look at by various variables. So you can see your brand equity tracking result changing by whatever filter you want to see it by, whatever is pre-agreed upon, whether that's age, whether that's demographic, whether that's market. But yeah, you're able to very clearly see where you're weaker with, who you're stronger with, and what's kind of and draw again correlations and see what you need to do.
All right, brilliant. So again, so building onto that, how would you say that Sila differs from other social listening tools?
So one, it's not social listening. I mean, it is social. I mean, when you're talking about social listening, you're looking at you have a very specific perspective on social listening, which gives you certain metrics, basic metrics, right? Like volume of conversation, etc. But when you include the concept of AI-enabled research or AI-based brand tracking, or when that artificial intelligence angle comes in, which is almost saying social listening on steroids, right? Because then you are able to draw, like I talked about historic, I talked about correlation, I talked about the contextualization of a lot of things. That is only possible through when you have an AI perspective to it. Otherwise, you get a very superficial understanding and you're not able to draw all those correlations we talked about, all that story we talked about, all that contextualization we talked about from a category perspective, from a market perspective, from history perspective, or even the different, like I said, offline, online, even your performance. Everything comes together and AI kind of puts that one story together for you.
Brilliant. So yeah, so another follow-up question to that is, where do you get the data from?
The data is pretty much everything that's online, right? So you have data that is, social media. So social media, everything's about public, right? So Twitter is a key source. Other social medias, your Facebook brand pages. So anything, so it's easier to talk about exclusions. So the only exclusions would be Snapchat and from a social media world, Snapchat and anything that's private on Instagram and your personal pages of Facebook. But otherwise, anything that's public across these platforms is accessible to you in terms of whatever is happening in terms of that. But apart from that, there's a huge chunk of information that's there on, let's say, Google, on your review platforms, Amazon search, Amazon reviews, Noon, third-party platforms. If you're a travel platform, Make My Trips, Clear Trips, Vigos of the world. So there's a lot of chunk of reviews, ratings, Google reviews, Google ratings. So anything that's available online that all kind of, again, comes together in terms of sources of information. Social media, of course, always forms a significant chunk of data, but there are multiple sources depending on the category, what's relevant, how it's relevant. The access is there, and whatever is relevant comes together to address and track your brand health overall.
Brilliant. So another question that also came through, what is a good frequency of a digital brand health tracker? And what are the deliverables? So are these, reports, dashboards?
So deliverables are very simple. Deliverables are, you have a typical, so there's a dashboard for sure, which is real time. So you have real time, it changes on an everyday basis where it kind of it's an automated process where you get it. But we strongly believe in consultative approach where you actually are able to take that data and create a story out of it or talk about the impact is from a strategic perspective, right? That's where researchers or strategists or people come in picture because everything else is AI, and that's where you start building stories and talking about a way forward brands can take forward. And the frequency can honestly vary, right? From so your dashboard is every day updated, it's an auto updated, but the frequency of question becomes more relevant from a reporting perspective. And it's very similar to, again, anyone who's done regular brand tracking using any of the traditional agencies. They have an option of either monthly, quarterly, biannual, or annual reports. What I personally suggest is you have a basic metrics that are captured on a monthly basis because there's not much that changes month on month, but then you do have a strategic report either every 6 months or every 4 months, every 3 months, every quarter kind of a thing, which kind of gives you a more strategic perspective. And then of course an annual report. But your monthly can be a very simple document just talking about if there's some specific depending on your campaign calendars also, it can be kind of worked out in a way which matches your campaign calendars and everything else.
Great. Great. So there's one more question, which is, very, very interesting. So can ChatGPT be integrated into AI market research process?
Okay, that's a webinar in itself. So it's an open-ended question. Look, by the way, just launched ChatGPT 4 today. Yeah, so it's a more evolved version today. There's a lot of ChatGPT discussion. Now, this question, I don't know whether it's specific to brand health equity, or is it it sounds like a general question, which is more respect to market research as an industry. So if it's a general question and which is not directly related to the topic, but of course, yes, there are various ways to use ChatGPT and integrate it in the entire process of market research to make it more agile, to make it more faster, to make it less human dependent. But of course, it comes with its own, I mean, you need human intervention. And like I said, it's a webinar in itself, but yeah, in simple words, yes, is the answer. It can be integrated right from developmental stage to results. From a specific brand equity perspective, not necessarily. Brand equity is a very specific topic where you're capturing real-time data, understanding the status of your brand. It can help in some of the mechanics of kind of understanding either competitive framework and everything, but it can't really be integrated as, at least now, in terms of how it can be. I've not really explored ChatGPT 4 and how it's different from the previous freer versions. But it has a lot of limitations. So specifically to this kind of a study, not yet.
All right. Great. So yes, so we do have another question. So is there any manipulation required from the client in order to generate the dashboard?
Is there any manipulation required?
Yeah.
Is that I'm not sure if I got that, if I understood the question, but if I'm just taking leap of faith here, I'm not sure what the question could potentially mean. But if it's customization, yes, customization is possible in terms of dashboarding, in terms of how you want to see the dashboard. There is a lot of information when it comes to let's say especially paid media, we need information in terms of campaigns, in terms of spends, etc. And for the other brands, we kind of have a mechanism to calculate spends and everything. But I'm still not sure if I've answered that question, because the question to me is not very clear. But there's a dashboard that is real-time updated, and customization is possible, if that's what it meant.
So the question was, what's the role of the client in terms of generating the dashboard? So does Sila do all the work and just deliver the dashboard? What role does the client?
Oh yes. It is. There's no input. So there are inputs from the client. So a client's role is, of course, there's strategic. I mean, of course, right from they're a part of the journey, but there's nothing that needs to be done. But we as consultants need to understand the business challenges, and most importantly, how they want to see the data. Because like I said, there could be a specific interest to see a certain type of data in a certain way, and that's where what kind of review filters you have. So I want geographic, I want age bands, I want to see it specifically by genders, data by gender, because there could be like there could be a need. And I know like banks right now are coming out to us and say, I want to target a specific nationality. We are very Western focused, or we're very Indian focused, we need to target Emiratis, or vice versa. And then it becomes necessary to have a dashboard where you tell us this challenge, and where we then create, the implication is then we create something where you can actually have it by nationality, where you might say that I want to see data by expat Asians, expat Arabs, and let's say locals. That could be a filter in itself, because that's of strategic relevance. For someone else, it may not be important. Age could be a dynamic. Then that's how you kind of. So there are standard filters we have, and there are standard products that we have, but then there could be customized in terms of what the needs are and what the requirements are.
All right. So a bit deeper into that as well, can you elaborate a bit more on what kind of insights can be given in terms of the audience analysis?
So you have demographics. That's one which is easy, I think, right from national. We have a dialect analysis, so you can actually not only at an expat Arab level, but what we do is also, apart from the regular age stuff and everything, you can actually use dialects. So people have a certain way of writing. So an Egyptian writes or comments or like a certain way, and they construct a sentence, which we call as the different dialects, the 26 dialects in the Arabic world. So that is another additional data point that you can actually, which acts as a near time, it's almost, a surrogate of nationality. Because we've seen in the past in certain studies where, let's say, one of the airlines had an issue with a specific nationality flying out, and they kind of had to do a diagnosis on it. Apart from the basic demographics, this is the dialect one, and then you have psychographics. So psychographic understands who your audience is from a personality perspective. So whether there's certain models that we use that are in place, very well researched models, which are I think models like Big Five, etc. Again, a topic in itself, but gives you a full picture of the psychographic makeup or the mental makeup of your audience in terms of who they are, what can motivate them. So are they people who you would want to target or who get influenced by, let's say, a digital communication, or social media, or something else, or offline interactions? Or interestingly, are they driven by image, or are they driven, let's say, by product utility? So hence your communication to them changes, saying that your audience is driven by product communication, product utility. Then you'll talk about, then you talk about the quality of your product, right? Saying that it has the most features, hypothetically. And if they're driven by brand image, you'll talk about the premium aspect of it, or how good it'll make you look like. So it gives you aspects that kind of help you in your communication and in your overall strategy towards it.
So a follow-up on that, based on what is this information analyzed or driven? Is it, the need, the personality and the needs and the behaviors? Based on what do we get this?
It's again a combination of combination of science, or AI, which is really about going, but simply put, it's more having a historic view of, let's say, if Lena is an individual, is a part of a certain profile of this target audience. So access to the brands you follow, the people you follow, the content you share, and a lot more, your social media behaviors and other behaviors, kind of a thing, digital behaviors that we have access to, or even what time or how much our technology allows us to even access a heat map that tells me 24/7 what is the time you're most active online, on social media. So are you a 3 a.m. person, or are you a 3 p.m. person? So there's a lot of information that kind of gets gathered in terms of behaviors, in terms of your interests, in terms of your affinities, your interest areas, where you can then it allows you to infer your needs, your value system, your personality. And like I said, there's an entire science behind it, but it's very, very highly accurate stuff now.
All right. There is one more question. What are the dialects that are covered that you mentioned earlier? Yeah, I can give it's a laundry list. I'm not sure if you
I think I think in Arabic you have 26, 27 dialects, but what we do is I think 20, 21, if I got that number right. We're still building on, but it has right from Saudi, Emirati, Egyptian, Lebanese, Iraqi, Sudanese, and the list goes on. But it pretty much covers everything where you have your and there's a big chunk that is the modern standard Arabic, which is basically, pardon me for the pronunciation, but the Fusha, which is your classical Arabic. So you've got that, and apart from that, you've got that. We also are able to do Arabizi or Arab English, because nowadays especially the younger ones, and especially in Egypt, you see a lot of people typing using Roman numericals in conjunction with your alphabet. So that gets captured in terms of, or potentially can get captured as an independent dialect, so to say. It's not a dialect, but a form of writing.
All right. Perfect. And then in general, or overall, what is the accuracy rate for Sila?
It goes so across different models. It is 90. I don't remember the exact number, but I think it's 92% plus, where we've done it across models, where we've done testing. And the accuracy is and the reason for accuracy is primarily because someone just asked the question around dialects, is because what happens is that any other technology that uses or is used is basically what it goes is through a translation process. So you capture and gather data in Arabic technology, or they use technology like not Google Translate, but an equivalent, or Google Translate or an equivalent Google, where it kind of translates that data into English, and all the analysis, interpretation, contextualization is done on the translated version. And the translated version can never have the essence of what the person actually meant. And that's where the accuracy, kind of the difference between a good, bad accuracy is this, where so Sila, for example, our technology captures data directly in Arabic, analyzes, interprets directly in Arabic, or on the original language of the consumer or the brand or whatever that content is. And that's the difference between a good accuracy and a bad accuracy. And because of that, we would not like to believe we've done enough tests to understand the huge gap between accuracy between anyone who's using a translation tool versus someone who kind of analyzes and interprets data directly in language, or in the origin of language, in the language is intended to be said. That's a lot of questions.
Yes, which is great. Are there any other questions? Anyone would like to reach out? All right, so I'll just give it a quick minute. All right, so I mean, thank you so much, Faisal. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for your thoughtful questions.
This will be available, I think, on our website and will be circulated to the participants and beyond. But please reach out for any additional questions, case studies, anything you'd like to reach to Lena or the team or on the website, or to directly us. Happy to help. Absolutely. And as a contact as well, you can find all the information on the website, silainsights.com. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much. Hope to see you all very soon. Thank you.